imagine for a second that you're running this massive manufacturing facility in Vietnam,
Hmm.
and it's late 2025.
Okay. Setting the scene.
Right. So you've got your orders piled up, your margins are perfectly dialed in, and everything is just humming along on the factory floor.
The dream scenario, basically.
Exactly. But then, bam, geopolitical tensions flare up in the Middle East,
Mm.
which is, thousands of miles away from your supply chain.
Right. Something you'd think has absolutely nothing to do with your quarterly projections.
Yeah, exactly. But suddenly, your facility's energy costs just skyrocket by like 30 to 50%,
Mm.
seemingly overnight. Your profit margins are instantly wiped out, and you have zero structural leverage to negotiate.
I mean, it is the ultimate nightmare scenario for anyone managing a global supply chain. Because look, you can optimize your labor force, you can streamline your materials, perfect your shipping routes.
Right, all the normal stuff.
Yeah, but if you can't control the underlying cost of simply keeping the lights on, keeping the machines running, you are completely at the mercy of these chaotic global commodity markets.
And that structural vulnerability is basically the launch pad for today's deep dive. We're unpacking this fascinating strategy document today. It's called Vietnam's Energy Resilience Strategy: How Manufacturing Survives Global Energy Shocks in 2026.
It's a great read, honestly.
It really is. And our mission today is to understand how Vietnam is taking this massive, crippling national vulnerability and transforming it into like a profound competitive superpower. Because if you buy or source or care about global supply chains at all, there's this core takeaway from the source. It essentially says energy costs are manufacturing costs.
Yes, you just cannot separate the two.
You can't. And to give you an analogy, Vietnam's manufacturing sector was basically like this high-performance sports car, right? Growing at an incredible 12 to 15% annually. But its gas tank was 90% filled by these completely unpredictable, super expensive external suppliers.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is how that 2025 shock acted as a brutal catalyst. I mean, it forced this realization that temporary band-aids like state subsidies or whatever, they just weren't going to cut it anymore for an industrial economy of that scale.
Right. It had to be a structural change.
Exactly. So in March of 2026, the government basically declares energy security a national priority, like a matter of survival. And they unleash this staggering $136.3 billion investment pipeline through 2030 just to modernize the grid.
136 billion. I mean, that is huge. But before we get into how they're spending all that cash, we kind of need to understand the broken system they're replacing, right?
Yeah, the vulnerable baseline.
Right. So looking at the 2025 energy mix, it's pretty wild. You had coal at 38%, hydro is 28%, imported oil and gas made up 21%, and renewables, a measly 3%, which was like 2% solar and 1% wind.
Yeah, and if you look at the structural flaws, the oil dependency alone was just a massive liability because, Vietnam actually used to pump a lot of its own crude. I think it peaked around, 370,000 barrels a day back in 2004?
Something like that, yeah.
But by 2025, that domestic production had plummeted by 85%, down to just 55,000 barrels a day.
Wow.
Yeah, so to feed this massive manufacturing base, they were forced to import 14.15 million tons of crude in 2025 alone. So whenever the spot market jumps, the entire country just eats a devastating premium. And coal is cheap, sure, but it severely stresses the grid during peak demand.
Okay, but looking at that baseline, I do want to push back on one thing.
Yeah.
Because hydro makes up 28%.
Right.
And from what I understand, once a dam is built, it's super reliable and the energy is incredibly low cost. So why not just take a chunk of that 136 billion and, build more dams? Just dam every river you can.
It's a fair question, but the document actually addresses this directly. The issue is that 80% of their viable hydroelectric sites are already developed.
Oh, really? 80%?
Yeah. Mostly across the Mekong and Red River basins. And the remaining 20%, they face these massive environmental hurdles, plus, complex community resettlement challenges.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, so their projections show hydro capacity is only going to grow by 6 to 8% cumulatively through 2030. They're just literally running out of rivers. But there's another issue with hydro, which is the monsoons.
Right, the seasonal volatility.
Exactly. From May to October, you get heavy rains, and the grid actually runs a surplus. But from November to April, the dry season water levels drop, And that creates this massive deficit. So under the old system, they had to constantly fire up aging coal plants just to fill that gap.
And so they're capped on hydro, their domestic oil is basically gone, and the spot market fossil fuels are bankrupting their factories.
So precisely.
So if you can't build more dams or pump more oil, you need a power source that you can deploy incredibly fast to stop the bleeding. And that brings us to the solar and wind revolution, because the speed here it's insane.
It really is. Speed is the entire strategy.
Yeah. The source says they are taking solar generation from 16.5 gigawatts to a planned 30 to 35 gigawatts by 2030. That is a 200% expansion.
In just 4 years, yeah.
It's staggering. It's like, okay, think about it like software development. Building a new coal plant is like building a massive legacy software system from scratch. You've got years of environmental reviews, pouring concrete, engineering. It takes 5 to 7 years.
Right, and you don't have 7 years when your factories are bleeding cash today.
Exactly. But deploying a solar farm, that takes what, 12 to 18 months?
Yeah.
It's like pushing an agile, rapid software update to the grid.
It's plug and play, relatively speaking. And while solar is the immediate growth engine, the wind data in the strategy document is also super critical, especially the shift from onshore to offshore wind.
Right, because right now they have mostly onshore wind. Right?
Yeah, about 7.5 gigawatts of onshore. But the new aim is 5 to 7 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030.
Okay, but moving turbines out into the ocean sounds incredibly expensive and complicated. Why go offshore?
The physics completely justify the cost. So onshore wind in Vietnam averages around 5 to 6 meters per second. But once you move offshore into deeper coastal waters, you consistently hit wind speeds of 8 to 9 meters per second.
Okay, that doesn't sound like a huge difference on paper.
It doesn't, but wind power increases exponentially with speed. So that bump in wind shear translates to a massive jump in generation. Offshore wind gives them a capacity factor of 35 to 45%.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, compared to onshore, which is only about 25 to 30%. Plus, putting these massive turbines in the ocean means you aren't taking up valuable, densely populated agricultural land in the Mekong Delta. So all told, this pushes their renewable mix from 3% in 2025 all the way to 32% by 2030.
Okay, so that's a massive green pivot. But I've got to play devil's advocate here for a second, because we need a reality check on the fossil fuels. While reading the source, I saw this apparent contradiction. If Vietnam is going all in on this $136 billion renewable utopia, why are they simultaneously signing these 10 to 15-year supply agreements with Qatar, the UAE, Angola, and Russia for oil and gas?
It definitely looks like a contradiction at first glance.
Right. It seems like they're just locking in more carbon.
But you have to understand the difference between baseload and peaking power. You simply can't run a massive industrial sector purely on sun and wind right now. The battery tech isn't there yet at scale. So coal and oil aren't going away, their roles are just changing.
Changing how, exactly?
Well, coal is dropping to 26% by 2030, and they've halted all new coal plants post-2027. So instead of being the primary engine running 2047, coal becomes a backup generator. It steps in only when renewable generation dips.
Okay, but what about the 15-year oil and gas contracts?
Those aren't about expanding fossil fuel use. They're a financial hedge.
A hedge.
Yeah. Remember the 30 to 50% spot market spikes in 2025?
Right, the nightmare scenario.
Exactly. By locking in these long-term contracts, the government is just setting a predictable price ceiling. They're insulating the economy from global shocks, not trying to burn more gas.
Okay, so tying this back to the listener, if you're a buyer and you're sourcing from a factory running purely on grid coal or gas, your blended costs are going up. But the document mentions that factories are actually installing their own rooftop solar, right?
Yes, aggressively.
And by doing that, they're cutting their localized grid costs by 25 to 35%, which is huge. But obviously, Vietnam isn't doing this in a vacuum. To really know if this strategy works, we have to look at the regional scorecard.
The factory wars.
Yes, the factor wars. Let's talk about the competition. The document rates China's energy vulnerability at an 8 out of 10, which is wild to me because China has an absolutely massive renewable footprint.
They do. They dominate global solar. But China has a massive Achilles heel. Their curtailment rate.
Curtailment meaning?
Meaning power that's generated but literally can't be used. It sits at around 15 to 20% in China.
Wow, a fifth of their power is just wasted.
Exactly. Because they generate it in the West, but their ultra-high voltage transmission lines connecting to the eastern factories are underdeveloped. Plus, they still rely on coal for over half their mix, and they import 70% of their oil.
Okay, so that explains the 8 out of 10. And then there's India, which gets a 9 out of 10 for vulnerability. They're sitting on a 70% coal reliance.
Yeah, and India's reliability is the heat waves. Right before the monsoons hit, around April and May, residential demand for air conditioning spikes just as hydro and wind output are at their lowest.
Right.
So the grid routinely fails, causing crippling power outages for the manufacturing sector right when they need it most.
That's brutal. And then you briefly look at the others. Indonesia's a 7 out of 10, mostly because trying to wire an entire archipelago with submarine cables is an absolute nightmare.
Totally.
And Thailand is a 6 out of 10 because they rely heavily on imported gas from Myanmar and Laos, which has its own geopolitical risks.
Yeah, so if we connect this to the bigger picture, Vietnam's rating is a 5 out of 10. And that's not because they have the most green energy in absolute terms. It's because they have the most reliable, rapidly deploying mix.
It's structurally sound.
Exactly. And that integration gives them a massive structural cost advantage over every regional alternative by like 2027 or 2028.
Okay, so understanding all that macro stuff is great,
Yeah.
but we really need an action plan. What does this all mean for your wallet right now, sitting here in June of 2026?
Right. Let's get into the timing.
According to the document, we are currently in the peak cost window. Grid costs are like 12 to 18% above the 2024 baseline. So human instinct says, hey, let's just wait it out until prices drop.
But the document explicitly says do the opposite. The strategy for importers right now is to lock in 12 to 24-month contracts immediately.
Wait, lock in while prices are high.
Yes, because factory owners are feeling that margin compression right now. They are desperate for volume certainty to justify keeping the lights on, so they'll offer what the source calls desperation pricing. They'll give you below-market terms today just to secure your business through this messy transition period.
That makes perfect sense, because if we map out the timeline by Q4 of 2026, which is just months away, 4 to 5 gigawatts of solar and 1 to 2 gigawatts of offshore wind physically plug into the grid. And that instantly drops grid costs by 5 to 8%.
Right, and then by 2027 to 2028, costs normalize completely back down to those highly profitable 2024 levels.
So if you wait for the grid cost to drop before you sign, you've lost all your leverage. The factories will be fully booked by the guys who locked in early, and they won't offer you a dime of a discount.
Exactly. It's not just about finding the cheapest t-shirt or, microchip today. This entire strategy is about future-proofing your supply chain against inevitable global energy shocks.
Yeah, which brings us to the end of the journey here. We've seen how this brutal 2025 energy shock forced Vietnam to completely reinvent its grid, right?
Yeah.
Pivoting to this $136 billion renewable strategy, securing baseload with smart financial hedges, and basically outpacing the massive grid bottlenecks in China and India.
It's a masterclass in turning a vulnerability into a sovereign advantage, really.
It truly is. But before we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final kind of provocative thought to chew on.
Ooh, all right. Let's hear it.
So the source noted that factories are installing their own rooftop solar right now, achieving these 25 to 35% cost savings. Well, if energy resilience really is the ultimate competitive advantage, will we soon see a future where the world's most powerful manufacturing facilities basically become their own independent utility companies?
Oh, that's interesting.
Right, like completely detaching from national grids and maybe even selling power back to the countries that host them. Think about how that flips the power dynamic.
That would change everything about global foreign direct investment.
Exactly. Something to think about. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the strategy document. Keep questioning the unseen forces that dictate the flow of the goods you rely on every day.